we will be discussing the tenacity of racism and its challenge to religious faith with a really wonderful panel of guests. My name is Audrey. I am the Director of Communications for the John Mitchell Jr. Program for History, Justice, and Race at the Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. It's a mouthful, but it's a combination of 3 amazing institutions. And we are so lucky to be partnering with Busboys and Poets tonight for this event, which is part of the A.C.T.O.R, continuing talk on race series, which has been ongoing, and Andy will tell you a little bit more about that. Before I switch over to Andy and Dr. Chavis, tonight's moderators, I just want to remind you that this is a webinar format, which means that your video and audio are automatically toggled mute. This is just so that we can have a dynamic discussion. But again, we have the chat for you to discuss with us any of your thoughts, reflections. We've had some great conversations in the past and really encourage it. And as well, you can put your questions for the speakers in the Q&A box, and then myself and my colleague Ajane Roundtree, who is helping moderate the chat, will help moderate the questions. Just a reminder, this is live on Facebook, on Busboys and Poets Facebook page. And it is being recorded as well so that we can share it out with our networks, and you can share it out with your networks too after the fact. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Andy to introduce tonight's speakers, and then hand it over to Dr. Chavis as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Audrey. It's a pleasure to do this again. This wonderful conversation on race, A.C.T.O.R, a continuing talk on race. We started this series when I first opened Busboys and Poets in 2005, and it's been an ongoing series, one of the most successful ones, probably one of the longest continuing series, conversation on race. And I remember when we started this conversation, a lot of people, especially after the election of Barack Obama, said, yeah, why are you so obsessed with race? Isn't it time to move on? We clearly see that it's not time to move on. It's time to start moving forward on this. But we have not certainly moved on in this country. We are far from it, and we're seeing that through the protests and all the things that are happening on the street. We continue to have this conversation. We're proud to be joined with George Mason University Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution and the John Mitchell Jr. Program for History, Justice, and Race as our partners in this ongoing communication or ongoing conversation on race, given the conditions that have happened with the pandemic. It's given us an opportunity to realign and redo things a little differently, and sometimes great things come of it. And this is one of the great things that I think that have come of this. So thank you so much for joining us. Please tell your friends. We continue to have this conversation about twice a month at this point, and we'll keep you posted on upcoming great conversations. So I want to turn it over to Charles for a minute to say hello to you, and then I will introduce our panelists for today. Dr. Chavis.
Oh, thanks. Thank you so much, Andy. And I want to thank all of our viewers for joining us tonight. I'm extremely honored. I come to you as Andy, as well as Audrey mentioned, from George Mason University's Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter School of Peace and Conflict Resolution. I'm also the executive director of the John Mitchell Jr. Program for History and Race. And this is a newly established program within the Carter School at Mason that centers around narrative change and social transformation. One of the projects that we focus on, and that we're really, this event really marks the official launch of this program, is the Black and Jewish Forum of America. And this is a forum in which we hope to engage both the Black and Jewish communities and really build on and extend on the legacy of the Black and Jewish Alliance, and find out what are the next steps as we move forward into this next phase of the current freedom struggle. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Andy. Thank you again, and I look forward to an amazing conversation tonight.
We're very excited to have with us 3 great speakers and people that will sort of lead the conversation. We don't want this to be a one-way. We want it to be interactive. So those of you that have questions or comments, please make them, and we'll try to get to them toward the end. But I want to introduce Yolanda Savage-Narva. She is Executive Director of Operation Understanding DC, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting understanding, cooperation, and respect while fighting to eradicate racism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of discrimination. Welcome, Yolanda.
Thank you.
I'm going to be brief with the introductions just because I don't want to take up a lot of time. These are quite accomplished folks, and through the conversation, this will come out. We also have Dr. Suzanna Herschel. She is the Eli Black Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. Her scholarship focuses on Jewish-Christian relations in Germany during the 19th and 20th century, the history of biblical scholarship, and the history of anti-Semitism. Welcome, Dr. Herschel.
Thank you very much.
And we have Jonathan Prinz. He was born in Great Neck, New York, 8 weeks to the day after his parents and 2 older siblings, Nazi refugees, disembarked in New York. 2 years later, his father, Joachim Prinz, who had been one of Berlin's leading rabbis and a powerful critic of Hitler, assumed the pulpit of a large liberal congregation in Newark, New Jersey. Jonathan Prinz, along with his father, attended the 1963 March on Washington, where the elder Prinz delivered the speech immediately preceding that of Martin Luther King Jr. So it's great to have you here as well, Jonathan, and to put some perspective on history, being that the March on Washington is coming up this Friday in 2020. Welcome, Jonathan.
Good to be here.
It's a pleasure to have all of you here. I want to start with Yolanda. I know Operation Understanding has been around for quite some time here in Washington, and it was started to bring together Jews and Blacks here in Washington and throughout the country. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Also, I want each one of our speakers as a sort of a start is to think about the moment we're in right now. I mean, this is a historic moment I think we're all facing, not only with the pandemic, not only with all the other things, not the election only, but the protests that are taking place, which are remarkable, very different than protests in the past, where people of different backgrounds, different races, different religions and colors are all coming together to talk about race and racism and anti-racism here in this country. This is unprecedented. So I wanted each one of you to sort of reflect on that moment and whether to think of it, is this a fleeting moment? Is this something that's going to just, be just window dressing, or is this something that really is going to have some long-lasting systemic change? So I'll let you take it away, Yolanda.
Thanks so much, Andy. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for having me tonight and to be a part of this esteemed panel. I'm looking forward to having conversations around racial justice and equity and what we all can do to make sure that this moment in time is not something that fleets and we can actually make something happen. Andy, it's interesting you bring that up because I've been thinking a lot about the time that we're in and how to frame it, because as I process it as a person who's also living this life, I also have to process this as a person who's doing this work around racial justice and equity. And with us living under the shadow of a global pandemic that's disproportionately affecting Black, Indigenous, and people of color, really unearthing the gross health inequities and disparities in this country, the continued killing of unarmed Black and brown people at the hands of white supremacy and white dominance, the rise of anti-Semitism, the passing of 2 civil rights icons, Reverend C.T. Vivian and Congressman John Lewis. Looking at where we are, I think with kind of our legislative piece, we're at the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the 100th anniversary of the passing of the 19th Amendment. And then we have the first Black Southeast Asian HBCU graduate, member of a Black sorority, a woman who is the nominee for the vice presidency of the Democratic ticket. What does this all mean for us? And I think it's a moment in time that is unprecedented and is calling on all of our humanity to be a part of the movement that we see and to be a part, sorry about that, and to be a part of making things better for everyone. And so that's where Operation Understanding DC comes in. OUDC is a nonprofit organization that really works to build an intercultural community. We work with students from around the DMV to teach them how to think about racial justice and equity in a way that is part of everyone's story, that it's a human connection. This program has been around for 26 years, And we ask our students to commit to really learning about one another's history, to building those bridges that really need to be built in order to understand how important it is to fight for justice, equity, and against discrimination for all people. As we approach the March on Washington, I'm reminded even more than ever that organizations like OUDC, discussions like these are really paramount to us figuring out what the next steps are to actually achieve racial justice and equity in this country. And this is the moment in time to do that. I don't want this to just be something that passes in a couple of months. We are living in a time where we are all responsible for one another.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. Let me turn to Susanna at this point, and then I will go to Jonathan at the end. Susanna, can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now, and what is the this moment that we're in right now, this changing almost at a seismic level change that we're experiencing? How does that play into your world?
So my own world is as a teacher, as a professor. So, but when I look at what's happening this year, what I find so extraordinary are the terrible extremes. On the one hand, we live, of course, as we know, in a country of white supremacy, but now we have neo-Nazis. We have white nationalists marching in the streets. I never thought I would see this. I am, like Jonathan Prinz, a child of a refugee from Nazi Europe. Who would expect such a thing in this country? And this, I think, is shaking me and all Jews to the core, and I think all Americans and all over the world, people are shocked that this country could behave such a way. And on the other hand, finally, we have voices of protest in the streets. And what sparked it is what actually reminds me of a verse in the Psalms. It says, they have eyes but do not see, they have ears but do not hear. We've known for a long time, we have had eyes, but we haven't seen the racism and the violence. And finally, we're beginning to see for the first time, many Americans, what's going on. And look what just happened today in Kenosha, Wisconsin. This is going on over and over again. Now, the question that's facing us, of course, is what is the nature of this country? Who are we? And we claim to be a democracy, and that democracy is now under threat. Can there be an America that is not democratic? Will this country be some kind of a has-been in the next few years? That worries me tremendously. At the same time, I think we're all wondering where to go. We've had a very impressive number of books published this year that have articulated the nature and the extent of the racism of this country. And I find those books extremely important, and I'm very glad that a lot of people are buying and reading and listening and hearing. That's great. At the same time, I wonder if we will emerge from this moment with terrible despair. Where do we find the hope to go forward? I have to say, when I hear that again today in Kenosha, Wisconsin, an African-American man getting into a car with his children is shot in the back, what, 8 times by police? How do we emerge from despair and continue to have hope? And where will our hope come from? What will give us the strength to pursue when we're surrounded by such a horror and we see the extent of it and how ongoing it is? So I think that's the challenge. And I would say for those of us who are in the field of religious studies, anybody who is a person of faith, but anybody who is in despair, where do we find hope to go forward? So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susanna. Yeah, I think it's important for us to recognize what's happened with the shooting of another unarmed Black individual, Black man, and the the videos are so disturbing to watch. I mean, I have to stop it halfway. Like I cannot watch the whole video. I have not seen the video of many others that have been killed in this process, and I find it really alarming and disturbing that it's taken this long, as you mentioned, Susanna, for people to start seeing, as you mentioned, and started to hear. And it's great to see this this change. I think the jury is still out whether it's going to be systemic or whether it's going to be just a passing wind, but we'll see where it goes. Jonathan, I wanted to bring you in. You and your father were at the March on Washington back in 1963. And of course, there's going to be another march kind of resembling that march that's going to take place this Friday. Tell us a little bit about that time in history and how things have changed from then to now.
Thank you. I was there in 1963. I had literally a front row seat. There were some seats set up for people who were involved with the speakers or other things, and I had a front row seat. You know, Friday it's going to be 57 years since the March on Washington. And when I was thinking about this event, I said, why are we doing this? Why are we having this conversation 57 years later? And of course, it's a rhetorical question. We all know why we're here. But it's an extraordinary time, and Susanna talked quite glumly, and I have to join her in that. The fact that it's 57 years after that day of tremendous hope, no illusions, but tremendous hope. And here we are. Now, George Wallace is not sitting at the Resolute desk, but somehow, 20 years after his death, I see him sitting near or standing next to the person who was in that desk today. The spirit of George Wallace is very much alive in very high places, particularly in the highest place of the land. And Bull Connor has been dead for 30 years, 30 years. And still, white police officers are putting their knees on the necks of Black human beings. And that's very discouraging. When I started with, why are we here? I have to tell you, I'm very unhappy about being here. This is not what I thought would be. You know, we seem to have made some progress, and here we are talking about the same issues, seeing them every day, every single day, seeing those issues. But let me not be totally pessimistic, partially because I'm just not a pessimistic kind of person. But I think that what's happening on the streets is really not encouraging, it's exciting. It's inspiring. And I think there is a distinction between the March on Washington and that era, which produced some iconic figures, the last one of whom just died. You know, the kid that the establishment speakers were concerned about because they were looking at the White House and they were concerned that the president wouldn't like what he was about to say. Well, the kid grew up, of course, and has been an important figure, but they're all gone now. And I think that's significant too, because we have a movement now almost without leaders. Yes, obviously there are some leaders, but basically at past generations, there were these iconic leaders and everything depended on them. And right now, the movement is in the streets and the people are making the decisions to go out and walk. And I think that is something that is very promising for the future. We're living in an extremely dangerous time, and one can't overestimate that. And one can't take anything for granted in these days, including our democracy. But I think there is hope, and that hope is in the young people, the young generation in this country, and probably in the world as well.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Today is also a very important date. It's the birthday of Howard Zinn. August 24th, 1922. He died, I think, in 2010, maybe, or 11?
Yeah.
Maybe 12. I remember the day that he died. I think it was 2012, in fact, because I received the news while we were talking about the election that year. But anyway, Howard Zinn passed away, and he talks about pessimism. And I wanted to share a quote with you. He said, "I can understand pessimism, but I don't believe in it. It is not simply a matter of faith, but of historical evidence. Not overwhelming evidence, just enough to give hope. Because for hope, we don't need certainty, only possibility." And I think that's what we need today, the possibility of something better. And that's what keeps people going and motivated and excited about the next day and the next day after that. So thank you all. I don't want to turn this into a pessimistic time, because out of these types of difficult moments, lots of things can come out that can be much more lasting and much more effective for a future for this country. So I want to turn it over to Charles. Charles, please take it away for a moment.
Yes, thank you so much, Andy, and thank you. I want to thank all of our guests as well. The historian in me wants to call up some of the recordings that we have from the actual March 57 years ago. And so we're going to play a clip of Rabbi Prinz and during the speech. We have a few slides that are teed up, and so we're going to play those, and then we're going to discuss and work through this the speech, as well as talk about the current what we're witnessing. And Jonathan briefly mentioned this specifically as it relates to the decentralized nature of the current movement that we find ourselves in, but also he mentioned the coalition that is emerging, the interracial coalition that we're seeing, which is very reminiscent of what we see in some of the historic iconic photographs from the movement. One of the most famous ones is that of Dr. Heschel's father and Dr. King, one of which with them in Virginia. And so we're going to look through some of these historical images, as well as hear from the figures of history, and we'll come back right after.
I wish I could sing. I speak to you as an American Jew. As Americans, we share the profound concern of millions of people about the shame and disgrace of inequality and injustice, which makes a mockery of the great American idea. As Jews, we bring to the great demonstrations in which thousands of us proudly participate a twofold experience, one of the spirit and one of our history. In the realm of the spirit, our fathers taught us thousands of years ago that when God created man, he created him as everybody's neighbor. Neighbor is not a geographic term. It is a moral concept. It means our collective responsibility for the preservation of man's dignity and integrity. From our Jewish historic experience of 3,500 years, we say, our ancient history began with slavery and the yearning for freedom. During the Middle Ages, my people lived for 1,000 years in the ghettos of Europe. Our modern history begins with the proclamation of emancipation. It is for these reasons that it is not merely sympathy and compassion for the Black people of America that motivates us. It is, above all, and beyond all such sympathies and emotions, a sense of complete identification and solidarity born of our own painful historic experience. When I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned in my life, and under those tragic circumstances, is that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problems. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. A great people. Which had created a great civilization, had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of mass murder. America must not become a nation of onlookers. Must not remain silent, not merely Black America, but all of America. It must speak up and act from the president down to the humblest of us, and not for the sake of the Negro, not for the sake of the Black community, but for the sake of the image, the dream, the idea, and the aspiration of America itself. Our children, yours and mine, in every school across the land, every morning, pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States and to the republic for which it stands. And then they, the children, speak fervently and innocently of this land as a land of liberty and justice for all. The time, I believe, has come to work together, but it is not enough to hope together, and it is not enough to pray together. To work together, that this children's oath pronounced every morning from Maine to California, from north to south, that this oath will become a glorious, unshakable reality in a morally renewed and united America. Thank you.
Wow, such powerful words. Thank you so much for that, Audrey. Just looking to history and looking to those words, I think something that is just so consistent and present is this white silence, right? And I want to speak to, I would like for the panelists to speak to this, based on the speech that we just, the clip from the speech we heard, and the ways in which this silence is still pervasive to this day, specifically as it relates to, as I mentioned, this current phase in the struggle that we're witnessing, because I see this silence, something that is still so present. Indeed, we see a multiracial coalition, but amongst, outside of that coalition, there's still an abundance of silence. And so I really want to know, what do we say about this silence? and the ways in which, what are some of the ways in which we can root out this silence moving forward? That's just my first question. So I guess one at a time, Jonathan, if you would like to respond.
Yeah. You know, one of my sisters talked about the fact that many members of my father's congregation and within the Jewish community were wondering why he was so involved in these civil rights things after it wasn't our problem. And he told her, and she repeated, that for him, this was a Jewish problem. And what I'm saying by that is that unless each of us feels that these issues are our issues, they're not the issues of someone else, but they're our issues, we're going to remain silent because we're not going to really care. So I think the most important thing to begin with is to get engaged and to understand that if someone is not free, none of us are free. It's kind of a cliche, but it's absolutely the case.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Dr. Heschel.
You know, it's wonderful to hear Rabbi Prinz's speech from the March in Washington. And I also read his great memoir, his autobiography that was translated into English from German. And he talks in there about being in Nazi Berlin, and the people that he knew who were Christian ministers never called him up to say, how are you doing? Nobody called him. His friends, all living there in the Third Reich under Hitler, who knew these Christian ministers, they knew him, they knew perfectly well what was happening to the Jews. And so I think about that and just wonder if we can also encourage members of our congregations and communities, take at least a small step, make a phone call, don't keep silent, speak up, and begin by speaking too. So if you're white, call your African-American friends, ask them, how are you doing? What can I do? Show an interest. I have to say, I also think, you know, when we talk about hope for the future, I think about the prophetic tradition. And you know, the civil rights movement was, in fact, and Jonathan just alluded to this, it was a great ecumenical movement. And I find that extraordinary. And truly, when you look at, in the course of human history, to find something like this, civil rights movement, you know, Jonathan's father and my father both came from Nazi Germany, where there were Christians who said that the Old Testament should be thrown out of the Christian Bible because it's a Jewish book. And how can a Nazi have a Jewish book in the Bible? And they were doing that. And they come to America, and there's Dr. King and the leaders of the civil rights movement quoting from the Hebrew Bible, from Exodus, from Amos, from the prophets. That's really extraordinary and very important for us. And imagine what it did for these refugees from Hitler. No wonder so many rabbis went to Selma to march, and young people involved in freedom riders. Okay, there's perhaps a lesson there for us, because I think one of the things we learned from the prophets is that unless you understand despair, you can't offer hope. It would be superficial to say you should be optimistic if you don't understand the horror. And so perhaps there's some lessons there for us. I agree with what's been said already, that in many ways, the situation today is even worse than it was. Bull Connors, yes, he had fire hoses, but what do we have today? Guns, policemen shooting with guns. I can't believe what's happened. So maybe we need to take some lessons from the ecumenical work that was done, from the importance of alliances, of friendships, the friendships that were forged during the civil rights movement among young people and among ministers and rabbis and priests, to show perhaps that America can actually come together, at least in this group, and more might begin to join us. I would would at least like to think that that might be possible. But I would say that it's thanks to the civil rights movement that I became a professor of religion. It gave me inspiration. And inspiration is so much what we need today. Thanks. Thanks, Dr. Jones.
Thank you. Yolanda?
Thank you. Silence. I can't believe it's taken us so long to begin to speak up and to begin to be angry about what's been going on in this country for so long. And the silence really speaks volumes in my opinion. And I think we've finally seen what the damage that has been done by people being silent, by people saying that's not my problem, that's them, and I'm secure and I'm safe, and I would love to, I support people because I'm not involved in what's going on. It's almost this idea of I'm not racist. Either you're racist or you're anti-racist. You can't kind of fall in between. And in my opinion, that's where silence falls. Silence means that you basically turn your head and you allow things to happen. And so we're at an inflection point in our history where silence is not an option. And I don't want to see history repeat itself where people go off into their own communities and they're safe from what's going on, because today every single thing that happens is connected to humanity and affects us all in some way or another. If it's not one group that's targeted, it will be another group that's targeted at another time. And so this is our time to stand up and make our voices heard. That's why the protests are so powerful, because people are actually voicing how they feel about things. They're talking about things, they're chanting, they're making their voices heard, and that's empowering to do that. And so I think we finally get it. We cannot be silent and stand on the sidelines and hope that something is going to happen. Everyone has to put their sweat equity into this and make it happen.
You know, can I add something here?
Yes, please, go right ahead.
Complacency is part of it. And I will remind all of us of January 20th, 2009, which was, none of us who were at the March in Washington would, in our wildest dreams, thought that that would be possible, what happened on that day. And I think it was amazing, and it also made us complacent. It made us think that it had gone away. You know, this whole thing about being post-racial. And I think that we let our guards down. And now we have the absolute reaction to it. And that's what it is, it's reaction to it. You know, we live in a time where people, the oppressors, are playing the role of being oppressed. They're claiming to be oppressed. You're taking away my job. Oh, woe is me. You're taking away whatever. And that starts, you know, at the White House and goes all the way through. It's a typical thing, incidentally. Whenever you have an oppressed people, the oppressor tries to say, I'm the oppressed. And we can't be complacent about that. And we have become complacent. I think we are being awakened, for sure. And yes, silence is not good, but I hate to say it, but we've got to also vote. We've got to vote. If we don't vote, then forget about it.
May I say that I completely agree with you. And that is, what, if anything, what worries me right now. Yes, we're going to vote. Will our votes be counted? Yeah, so we're in very serious danger. But I agree, we were perhaps too complacent. I think we also have a tendency to be cynical, and cynicism is very dangerous, as is resentment, and that worries me. But I also wonder if we might also need to change the way we think. So why is it when people are in the streets protesting Black Lives Matter, they're called, what, hysterical, radical, etc. And the people who sit at home, callous, uncaring, indifferent, what do we call them? What do we call them? Why aren't they the ones who have something wrong with them, hysterical? You see what I mean? So we need to also rename what we're speaking of. And I'm very glad that Yolanda talked about anti-racism, because I think, you know, Ibram Kendi's book is an important one too. And that what is it to be an anti-racist? It's not just how you think, what you say. It's also active, doing. And in fact, I would say, what is it to be a human being? You're not just born and exist. You have a mandate. You have to do something. And I think also this discussion tonight is supposed to include some mention of Black-Jewish relations. We came up earlier. And I just want to say something briefly about that, which is how incredible it is to me that when I meet people from the civil rights days, to hear the gratitude they express to my father, who was a Jewish theologian, a rabbi, and to all the Jews who were involved in those days, the gratitude, and I'm struck by it. I think all of us need to have some gratitude. The gratitude we should be feeling for everybody marching in a Black Lives Matter demonstration. They're doing this for us, to save this country, to save it and make it safe for all of us, to save our democracy. It's important for us to be anti-racist in an active way, and it's also important for us to show gratitude in an active way, to express that. I am so grateful to the civil rights leaders for what they did in shaping my life, for making me love the Bible, which Hebrew school did not do for me, by the way. And inspiring me to become a religion professor. My whole life was shaped by this movement. And that's amazing to me. And I am so grateful. And for people to be grateful 50, 60 years later, there's an important lesson for us, because the civil rights leaders were developing a new kind of human being. Yep. They train themselves in nonviolence. Nonviolence doesn't just mean standing still. It's a way of thinking as well as a way of doing. And they, to me, are also models of what it means to be a human being in this world. And they're good models for us today, all these years later also. Thank you.
Wow. I did want to piggyback off that a little bit. I think something that I just began to reflect on as Dr. Heschel, you were speaking, was the role of the movement and the ways in which leaders and those who participated were characterized and demonized, right? And I thought about the current activists who are on the ground now, right? And the ways in which they too are being, you know, demonized. I mean, something that is really being enforced, you know, as we approach the election is this whole idea of law and order. Having, you know, the cities and mayors and governors get their streets back under control, right? You mentioned the spirit of Bull Connor, and there it is, right? And so I just want people to realize, like, when we see the young people protesting, these religious leaders from different faiths and different backgrounds protesting, we should look at them in the same way that we see the historical figures such as Dr. Heschel and Rabbi Prinz, and really get behind this movement, no matter how inconvenient, you know, this may seem. They're doing this for very important reasons. And I think it's something for those, and I'm speaking specifically to those who may be on the fence, right? Who want everything to get back to normal, right? You know, and not normal, but you know what I mean, right? And so I think it's so important for us to understand that. And so I wanted to transition to Andy now. Andy, did you have any questions or thoughts?
Yeah, I see Dr. Herschel is biting at the bit trying to say something. So I'm going to let you say something first. Go ahead.
No, I just said that, Charles, what you brought to my mind was something from James Baldwin, when he says, why is it when people protest in Harlem, let's say, in Watts, it's called a riot. And when the Jews were protesting the Nazis in April 1943, it's called an uprising. Let's think about our language and how we're also intertwined historically. And when you said about the demonization, you said a moment ago, it's so true, including, by the way, James Baldwin himself and some of the questions that he was asked, and you can see it on YouTube when he spoke to the National Press Club. It was so offensive. It's so horrible. Look what he went through. And yet he became a guiding light for us. And I also have to say that's something very important, because in this day of cynicism and resentment, you know, they had to go through it too, but they managed to preserve their humanity. They remained true to themselves. And I think that's very important for us too. No matter all the horror that's happening in Washington right now, in the White House, we have to remain true to ourselves.
Yes, Jonathan.
Can I add something here?
Sure.
You know, the idea of rebellion, and you know that what Baldwin said. The truth of the matter is, again, we had this illusion. The difference between Nazi Germany and the United States is, in Nazi Germany, everyone knew what it was. And the difference is that we had this illusion that we are this great democracy, the greatest country in the world, you know, the American, all that stuff, specialness. And that's an illusion, because within a democracy, you can still have horrible things happening, and those horrible things are facilitated by the democracy. After all, the President of the United States was elected in our system with a majority of the Electoral College. That's our system, democracy, and look what it brought. So I think
majority of the Electoral College, but not the vote.
Yeah, of course, I understand. 3 million votes, I understand. But the fact of the matter is that we have an illusion about ourselves. And that's why he said, made the difference between those two things, I think it historically is not quite accurate, because really we have a rebellion here, but within the context of a democracy, and it's a little different.
Yeah. Wow.
That's true.
Yeah, I've been referring to the protests as an intifada, which is the Palestinian term.
Yes.
But I wanted to speak a little bit about the gratitude that you spoke about, Dr. Herschel, and also what Yolanda mentioned earlier as well. I think we owe gratitude to Donald Trump. I mean, let's be clear here that had it not been for Donald Trump in office, we would not have this uprising. We would not have this awakening of people going out in the street. And I'm here to contend that that I believe a lot of the white folks that are out there, I'm not sure if they just suddenly got woke and suddenly realized that there is racial inequality here, but I think it started out because, frankly, Trump is an embarrassment. He's an embarrassment to white people. And he speaks about whiteness so much, and so much about him. So people's identity were being tied with him. And I think a lot of the young people were trying to sort of disavow themselves from this president and not appear to be in concert with his ideas. Being that the majority of white people did vote for him, the majority of white people got him into the White House, and you know we're yet to see the results. Had Hillary been in office, had Hillary been the president, the death of George Floyd would have probably been a very important moment, but it would have probably been dissipated very quickly, because Hillary would have gone to the family, she would have hugged them, she would have cried with them, she would have spoken at the churches, and she would have probably diffused a lot of the anger that took to the streets that motivated so many people to go out as well. Can you make comments about that?
Yeah, I just want to go back to what I started with. Why are we here? Why are we doing this? And I mean, 57 years later. And when you say, thank Donald Trump for awakening us, I say, shame on us. Shame on the American people. The fact that we are here talking about this today, shame on us.
Well, that goes without saying, Jonathan. So that's the awakening. I mean, I think people are finally realizing, because of movies and other things, that slavery was really not a good thing, that it was a terrible thing.
But if it took that to, I mean, with all the history that we have, with all the things that were going on, with all the, you know, the worship of Martin King's great speech, with all of that, the lip service paid to it. And yet it didn't really get into viscerally into our soul as an American people, and shame on us.
Yeah, and I think it's about, if you don't mind, really the controlling of the narrative, right? And what we do with that narrative, right? And when the dominant powers or forces have control of the narrative, you know, they can easily take a dream such as Martin Luther King and tie it into disillusion.
Right.
And so I feel like, you know, when we think about these overt examples that Black communities and Black and brown communities have continually suffered, you know, I have, you know, image of Breonna Taylor behind me, whose killers have yet to be arrested. And we also know of the recent incident in Wisconsin, right? And so for Black and brown communities, these are constant realities, right? But, you know, what we're witnessing now is an awakening and a reckoning. And I think, you know, to Andy's point, you can say that Trump created a culture and environment in which, you know, a sleeping giant, if you will. It was always here, right? But I think what his tenure has been able to do is awaken a giant and expose the illusion of systemic racism that has always been there, right? Because I think it's just so easy to highlight, you know, the overt examples that we constantly see over and over again. But what I think we're witnessing now is an understanding of the role that systemic racism plays and white supremacy plays in propping up what we know as democracy in this country.
Mm-hmm.
So the entire country and system was built on that. And I think today what we're seeing is that, you know, with the juxtaposition of this pandemic, it's right in our faces. We can't run from it. It's, you know, it's spilling into the streets that we inhabit, the places we live, and there's just no way to get away from it. And I don't know exactly, you know, what the tipping point was, but there may be a confluence of things that have happened simultaneously over the past 6 months that has just really awakened people in a way that they, I don't think that they really ever have been in the past. And today there's so many things at stake, and you can't hide from it and say that's, you know, that's going on in the Black community, because it spills over into the community. We're so intersectional in the way that we live and operate that you can't ignore this, and you can't think that it's not your, you know, it's not your problem, or it won't affect you, or it's not your issue. There's just no way to hide from that now.
I want to say that I agree that many more people have taken to the streets now than we may not have expected that some years or 10 years ago, let's say. I don't think, though, that as much as maybe some of us concerned about racism and wanting to be anti-racist may now be more mobilized, that may be true. But Trump has also mobilized these white nationalists and neo-Nazis. He has awakened the Klan. But more than that, they weren't simply people asleep that he woke up. He has seduced more and more white supremacists and white nationalists and racists and anti-Semites, and given them dog whistles and winks and allowed them to take their machine guns and murder people. What he has done to children of people seeking asylum, people seeking immigration, what he's done to those lives is unspeakable. I cannot imagine that it will be something that we can even possibly overcome in 50 or 100 years. This is a horror that we're going through right now. And he has bombarded us on an almost daily basis with a new horror every day. We can barely keep up. It's an assault. It's a kind of assault of cruelty and evil and wickedness that is coming as a verbal bullet, like a hammer every day to our lives. And what do? We scream every day, how could this be? This is wrong. And then the next day, it's a new horror. Now, what is this doing to us? And I also have to say that while I have enormous, enormous respect for everybody who is able with great courage to march in the streets on behalf of Black Lives Matter, how extraordinary. But I also want to remember that there are dozens and dozens of militias operating in almost every state in this country. I understand that 35 militias in the state of Georgia, each one with 100, 200, 500 members armed with automatic weapons, machine guns. And they meet every few weeks and they march around and they practice. Look what's been mobilized in this country and the horror that we face. This is very serious business now. We're talking about potential armed revolt against the democracy of this country. And that's very frightening. And this is happening not only on the level of the White House, it's happening in state governments, counties, and cities around the country. The police who think they can shoot a Black man in the back like that without a problem. 7, 8 times he's getting into his car. My goodness, who's allowing them to do, who's giving them the signal that it's okay, that it's safe? Is it the city? Is it the chief of police? Is it the police union? And is it the whole society?
I think that's what we mean when we refer about, systemic racism. These shootings and killings didn't just happen because the iPhone was discovered. This was obviously been happening for many, many years, and people didn't want to believe it. Like you said earlier in your opening remarks, Susanna, is that people see but don't see, and people hear but don't hear. And so that's been the problem. And I think maybe there's been a moment that has allowed people to see and hear a little differently.
Let me just say that may be true. And I'm glad that we have the video cameras now, of course, but let's also remember that there have been thousands of lynchings in this country, and they were witnessed, and they were photographed, and they were made into postcards and distributed. Millions of people saw this, so we're not actually the first generation to be witnessing. And why is it that those people were coming out of church on a Sunday, men, women, children, to go and watch a Black man, woman, or child tortured and murdered right after listening to their pastor give a sermon? What kind of a sickness is this? Now, Hitler killed 6 million Jews in a matter of a couple of years, but the lynchings here and the slavery, the enslavement has been going on every day for hundreds of years. It's a different phenomenon. And it involves millions more people as witnesses and beneficiaries financially in all kinds of ways.
Well, let me add that, change is very difficult. And vested interests are very powerful. It isn't, if you look at, look at what the women, we're talking about 100 years ago, Black women were not permitted to vote. And if you look at women today, if you look at the comments today about a woman who is running for office, any office, and the words that are used, we have vested interest. There are men, and mostly white men, who like where they are, and they don't want anyone else sitting in those seats. And we have very wealthy people who like to be where they are, and they don't want to really share it. So we have tremendous disparity. And make no mistake, there are a lot of people who are thrilled about the fact that Black people and people of brown people are more vulnerable to the virus than white people. They're thrilled to hear it because let's get rid of those people. We don't need them. And we don't need them, and they're encroaching on our territory, on our power. So this is it's an uphill fight, and it is for anything where change is required.
Yes, but of course, with the women's movement, as we've known for decades, you know, women may view men as being, let's say, roadblocks in our efforts at equality. But at the same time, at the end of the day, many of us get into bed with a man. We have male fathers, brothers, and children. So it's a different situation. And the problem of the racism of this country is so extensive and so deep and infiltrates every aspect of society, social structures and ways of thinking. I just find it quite extraordinary. How did it happen? How did this develop in such an extensive way? It's one of the most unbelievable phenomena of human history, that human beings would do such a thing. How
Yes.
did that happen?
And it's built into the American history.
Yes,
It starts a long time ago at the beginning.
absolutely.
Wow.
Charles, go ahead, take it, Charles.
I want them to keep going. I mean, this is so powerful. But I did want to give our audience a chance to respond. I know that we have probably hundreds of questions at this point. So I'm going to go to Audrey to see if we want to pull some questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you all. I'm going to, we have a little bit more time left, but in order to try to get to as many audience questions as we can, I'm going to kind of lump them together. So this first round, I think, is going to still kind of stick with that theme of silence. We've had a question regarding, two questions that are kind of along the lines of basically how can we, how do we address the evangelical Christian community? How do we address the fact that there are some among the evangelical community who do form so much of a base here in terms of, kind of sustaining these systems of white supremacy. So, one person in particular mentioned so many in these communities might fear speaking up because they fear being rejected from their own communities. So that kind of goes into another question from Stella O'Meara, who asked in our chat, basically, what can we do to help people who are currently silent get more involved and educate them? So, I think that goes to, again, how do you, maybe address some of the issues of community that keep people from speaking up, whether it's, because of religious beliefs or something else. So that I'm going to leave that there, and then I'll go to other questions once that kind of theme has been addressed.
My father always said, anti-Semitism is not the problem of the Jews, it's the problem of the anti-Semite. And as far as the evangelical community is concerned, I think that's a problem for them to address. They certainly have a significant problem, but I don't think that other people who are not of that religious belief or that group can really do anything about it. They have to do it themselves, and they do have a significant problem. And there are a lot of questions about how you can be deeply religious and yet have such deep prejudice.
It's quite the question. I agree with Jonathan that it's something that they need to address. I will also say that we have to look at religion in a way that we really focus on the positive pieces of it and not the negative pieces of it. And so I think in all religions, that there's a lot that can be interpreted in one way or the other. And it's left up to us to figure out how we interpret our religions in a way that is going to connect with the best in humanity, to make sure that we're fighting against something and not falling into some of the traps, I think, that sometimes interpreting religion in the wrong way can lead us down the wrong path.
Well, I agree and I disagree. I would say, first of all, that I think it's, if I left the study of anti-Semitism to non-Jews, there wouldn't be enough studying being done. There wouldn't be a whole lot going on. So in fact, Jews also, I think, have, or let me say, I have written a book about Nazi Germany, and I picked up on things that were being said in the documents and the archival sources that German Christian graduate students weren't saying. So I think that one brings a certain sensibility. I also have to say that reading the work of scholars such as Saidiya Hartman, for instance, writing about the impact of racism and slavery on the soul and the body of Black slaves, gave me tremendous insight into how we should think also differently in a more complex ways about the impact of anti-Semitism. So we have something to say to one another. Now, when it comes to the evangelical community, my feeling is we sit down and we talk about the Bible. You want to talk about scripture? You give me your verse, I'll give you my verse. We'll talk interpretation, but there are ways actually of discussing scripture that can change political viewpoints. And actually, people do evolve. Religious communities do evolve. When I was a student, I remember a woman saying, one day there are going to be Orthodox women rabbis. And I thought, she's crazy. That was Blue Greenberg. And you know what? There now are Orthodox women rabbis. So I think, my goodness, things do change. Things can happen. Things can get worse, but things can also get better. And it's important for us always to remember that evil is never the climax of history, as the prophets taught.
I wanted to add my piece as well. I think, someone who studied the black church, who studies the Black church, and so as a Christian, I think it's really important, and we're witnessing, specifically in the evangelical community, an experience to where Trump has awakened a version or a piece of the evangelical movement that has revealed that a lot of what principles the movement was founded on, it was based in the ideals and concepts of what it meant to be American, right? And I think, in looking at the whole idea of the American experiment, as a lot of scholars have mentioned, the 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones highlights this. But in looking at this, I think the evangelical community has failed to realize that slavery was legal and it was functioned within a democracy. It functioned within this American experiment. And now we have an individual such as Trump who has appealed to these American ideals, so-called American ideals that are so directly aligned and tickle the ears of those in a lot of the evangelical community. They've been willing, some have been willing, and this is important because I do see fractions in those who are separating or taking a stand within the evangelical community, speaking out against racism, but they're being marginalized, a lot of them within these communities. It's because because they've spoken out against it, right? And they've exposed the fact that, again, as Dr. Herschel said, if we talk Bible, right, what Trump is doing is different. But are we willing to again sacrifice the things that tickle our ears and continue to allow Black and brown people to be gunned down in the streets, right? I think specifically white clergy as well as Black clergy, what does that look like when you have a congregation full of Black, a majority Black congregation, right? And you are supporting this, the individuals who have been awakened by this current president, right? I think for a lot of Blacks in these evangelical churches, there's been a shift and a constant struggle And so I just wanted to provide that little bit of background, if that made any sense. So, oh, go ahead, Jonathan. Sorry.
Let's not forget
Yep.
Falwell and Robertson. You know, Trump had an audience that was prepared for him
Yep.
by a group of ministers who became basically right-wing Republicans, and they politicized their church.
Yep.
And so Trump didn't invent that; they invented that. He just had willing soldiers that were prepared by their leaders, and that's why I said that ultimately the problem is ultimately in the group that does that. It's not to say that Jews shouldn't be concerned about anti-Semitism. Of course they should, and they should battle it. But ultimately, it will never be solved until until white America decides that what they're doing is wrong. We're not going to solve the problem of racism. You know, it's that simple.
But let's remember that there are plenty of rabbis as well as evangelical ministers
Yeah.
who have been supporting Trump. And
Yeah, I'm just saying that, but the whole thing of this, of where it goes ideologically, begins with Falwell and Robertson and those people.
Gotcha. All right, Audrey, do we have another question?
Yeah, we have a few more. I just want to say, first of all, thank you to, as always, to all of our attendees, both here on the Zoom and those who are watching in on the FB Live. For our speakers, you know, I really definitely encourage you to go look at the comments in the FB Live after this. You know, unlike other comment sections on the internet, these comment sections are usually pretty inspiring. So thank you all. I'm gonna get to another round of questions. I'm not sure if I'm gonna get to every single individual question, but I'm gonna try to get to the themes. So the theme here for this next round is kind of looking forward again, kind of looking past to, you know, the past movements, you know, and then looking forward to, especially as we come up to this 57th anniversary march, and then going forward, just kind of this theme of how do we frame things? We have Eileen Kugler, excuse me, for example, who's asked, you know, who said that she's concerned about the messaging going on right now at the GOP convention, painting Black Lives Matter as violent and dangerous as a movement. And her question is, how do we reclaim the message? And then from the FB Live chat, we have a question from Haja Aisha Jeffries Sisse. She says, George Floyd's death created a tipping point in the movement, providing for a paradigm shift. Could the panel support a strategic change, one of a human rights movement? So I think she mentioned earlier a civil rights movement, shifting it to kind of a human rights movement under Black American leadership. She mentions, you know, what are some new lexicons and strategies, mentioning, you know, and some, you know, we haven't mentioned here is Haji Malik al-Shabazz, aka Malcolm X. So that was a lot. I'm gonna hand it over to our speakers for their thoughts.
Well, a word of caution here, and that is, you know, the answer to Black Lives Matter is, oh, all lives matter. Well, yes, of course they do. But I think that there is a danger here of putting it off, and by making it a universal problem. It is a universal problem, but we cannot deal with the universal problem without dealing with the individual problems. And Black Lives Matter, that has not been solved yet. And they are not, obviously not the only group that has that issue. But I think it's a little bit dangerous to make this universal, because one loses the fact that the suffering is very individual.
I just say amen to that. I think it's evident that that this is a humanity crisis that we're in, but I think we have to step back and really focus on the dehumanization and oppression of Black bodies in this country for the past 400 years, and how the economic foundation of this country has been built on that. And until we are able to adequately address that, I think we don't want to dilute our efforts and start thinking about using messaging and language that takes away from the need for every single person in this country, not just people who are Black, but everyone to understand that Black Lives Matter. And it's all of our responsibilities to make sure that Black Lives Matter in every sense of the word, and all of the structural, economic, systemic pieces of this country. And you know, for the past 400 years, that has been denied. The amount of historic trauma that has built up over time as a result of that is astounding. And so I just, you know, I just don't want us to lose sight of the urgency behind Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, we can't be distracted.
And I think as Nicole Hannah-Jones mentioned, you know, 1619 was the year when enslaved people were brought here into this land, and they're the true founding fathers of this country. But you're talking about 250 years of slavery, another 100 years of Jim Crow. We've only been out of this for 50 years. So it's you know, the majority of the years of the birth of this country has been under this apartheid regime that's been very, very damaging to, like many of you said, to everybody. Is this, let me ask a question, maybe rephrase, and I want to say hi to Eileen Kugler. She's an old friend, so it's great to have you on the call. But I wanted to ask something about the idea of truth and reconciliation. I know that in South Africa, when apartheid ended, there was a truth and reconciliation process that went through. In this country, we went through, of course, you know, 250 years of slavery. And then, you know, after slavery, there was a very short period of Reconstruction, and then Jim Crow came in for 100 years. And Jim Crow created, I think, the psychological damage that I think Susanna was speaking about, that psychological damage that has infected and really metastasized in this country for so many years. But are we ready for truth and reconciliation? Is this a time that we can actually start moving in that direction? And of course, that brings with it lots of issues like reparations, like those types of things that oftentimes are, you know, people are afraid to even bring up. But maybe all of you can speak to that. Yolanda, if you want to start out with that.
I think we're ready, Andy. I do think we're ready, and I think that may be the next step in the conversation around truth and reconciliation, and you know, tackling these big issues that I think we really need to discuss. And you made a good point. For 250 years, Black people were enslaved. For the next 100, they were under Jim Crow, and so we haven't really had a period of time that we've had any opportunity to recover from the trauma that has been imposed. And so we have to actually have these conversations that are probably going to be uncomfortable for people to have in order for us to really move to the next level, to the next stage of making something happen, and something, you know, systemic and lasting happen in this country. And while we are, you know, we're protesting, we're making our voices heard, more and more people are really embracing the fact that Black Lives Matter. I'm really proud of this moment. I'm proud to see that, but I do recognize that we're going to have to move past that. And this may be that next step. And there are a lot of conversations that are happening in different circles about what's next. How do we actually operationalize what we are talking about and what we're protesting about on a daily basis?
Susanna, Jonathan?
Yeah, you know, I think we are moving toward that. I think a lot of it has to do with understanding, Yolanda, understanding, right? I think that people who live in communities where there are statues to Confederate figures, we all know how they got there. They got there through the Jim Crow years, but we're forgetting about that. They're there, and they don't even understand that someone should be offended by that. That someone would be offended, let me not use the word for it, that someone would be hurt by that. So there's going to be a lot of uncomfortable conversations. And I think we need to get there. I don't know that we're there yet, but we need to get there.
Susanna.
Well, I actually taught at the University of Cape Town as visiting professor in 1996 during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission meetings. And what struck me about it was that it meant a great deal to a small number of people. And the truth is, I felt a lot of white people in South Africa who should have been very attentive and should have been listening to the television recording, live television and so forth, they were ignoring it. While I was there, there was a Women's Day, and the question was, well, white women and Black women, can they come together and so on? And I was just very struck by that. Why would a Black woman in South Africa in 1996 want to join some kind of club of white women? You don't just have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and then everything's resolved and you're going to sit down together and talk and become friends. It doesn't work that way. So the question really is, do we first dismantle what we've been talking about, which is systemic racism, the institutionalized racism, before we can begin to actually sit down and talk about reconciliation? I agree we need the truth. I'm not sure reconciliation, boy, a lot of white people would sure like that. But isn't that fair? Unfair? Isn't that manipulative? That makes me uncomfortable. I have to point out that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa was established by theologians, by John de Gruchy and Bishop Tutu, and it was based on the theological principles that were articulated in Germany, first by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was murdered by the Nazis, and then after 1945 by the Protestant theologians who then tried to come to grips in a Christian way with what had happened. And, when to be in South Africa and to see the luxury of white homes with living in gated communities, and then I see gated communities in this country going up. I mean, we're actually moving in the opposite direction from any kind of truth and reconciliation. And I live in Boston. Massachusetts is so liberal, so liberal. Boston is the most segregated city I've ever lived in. Unbelievable what goes on in this city and in this state. So let's also keep in mind that we're not just talking about some, Christian evangelicals in Mississippi or some such image that we have in our minds. We also have to talk about racism among, even this great liberal state of Massachusetts. And remember too, look at this pandemic. Racism is a public health crisis. It's about the body and the soul, both. So I don't think reconciliation, we're ready for that until we start dismantling a lot of what's going on in this country.
And we should also remember that it wouldn't even have taken place were there not a transfer of power.
Right.
Right? We don't have that here.
Right, we don't have that here.
We don't have that here. I mean, it really, that conversation was made possible because there was a transfer of political power in a very profound and fundamental way. And even then, those houses were there, those mansions were there.
Yes, and let's also keep in mind, this was an extraordinary gift given to white South Africans by Nelson Mandela, who was tortured and imprisoned. And yet he gave them this gift. And to this day, I'm looking for those white South Africans to say thank you on their knees. Thank you, Nelson Mandela. And to act their gratitude. Act it out. Because he gave it to them.
Yeah, we don't want those people in our suburbs.
Wow. On that note, I want to say thank you, everyone on the panel. Amazing. That's all I can say. And for those who can hear me in the back, if you didn't get it, vote. Right. Something I want to make sure I say before we close out. Vote. It's so important. Lives literally depend on it, and so I think it's so essential. And I'm so thankful for this panel and for this challenging and worthwhile conversation. I want to remind everyone to go to Facebook and like the John Mitchell Jr. page. We're a growing program, and we're so thankful for Andy for his support. And we want to continue to partner with scholars and organizations such as Busboys and Poets, who've been doing the work of justice as well as keeping our bellies full. And so thankful for Andy, and thank you all from those out there who are joining us. Until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.